Welcome to Philosophy 201, History of Modern Philosophy. It used to be called Philosophy 101, but Duke has decided to renumber all courses, as you probably have figured out. So it's going to be chaos for the first year. Nobody will know what course is what. Anyway, that's not relevant here. This is History of Modern Philosophy, as you can see from the board. I hope you'll be able to read this. I've tested it out a little bit. You can tell that we are starting in an unorthodox way because we thought what we would try to do is see how an online course works for 1 week. And if you take this course, we're hoping you will give us feedback about this first week, where you'll be watching 2 lectures by me. You won't be coming to class for the first week. I'm going to send an email about that soon, so you haven't figured this out yet, but you will by the time you see the video, of course. And we want to see how the online system works for you and whether it's better or worse than the regular old meet in the classroom system that you're all probably rather used to. Duke has decided to provide some free courses online through Coursera and a few other organizations. You may have heard about that. So one thing we're wondering is, how does philosophy work in an online environment? Do you think it works better or worse than meeting in the classroom? And we want to test this out, so we need your help. And in a way, you're guinea pigs for this course, but of course it's only 1 week, so it should be relatively painless. Plus, during the first week of classes, you don't have to show up in the classroom, so you get more time to do other important things. Okay, what we're going to be doing is, for the first video, introducing the course and introducing the history of modern philosophy and trying to teach you some basic concepts, and also giving you an idea of what the course is about so you can decide whether to take it or not. I'm always aware that there is course drop ad for the first, whatever it is, week or 2 of the semester. And so if you're not interested in taking the course, you have a right to know, well, what is this course going to be like in the first day? Of course, this is now online, but still you'll have a basic idea. Okay, so at the start, we start with this word modern. And this is a terrible word. If it had never been invented, it would be much better. The reason it's such a horrible word is people use it in 100 different ways. You probably have encountered this. Often people just mean contemporary by modern. You know, you say, well, I bought a new suit or a new car with a modern look. People think that means sort of cool, forward-looking, 21st century, contemporary, whatever it is. Obviously, we don't mean that in this course, or anyway, it'll be obvious in a minute. Another reason the word modern is so terrible is that people in different disciplines use it to refer to distinct, non-overlapping historical periods. There's modern architecture, there's modern art, there's modern sculpture, modern painting, modern music, etc. None of these things really fit with the history of philosophy. So it will now shock you to learn that in philosophy, when we say modern, we mean the 17th century, which obviously is not modern according to most people. So basically what we're talking about is 1640 to 1800. For those of you who took some history in high school before coming here or have already taken it in college, 1640 probably doesn't strike you as a particularly important year. It is important for philosophy, as we'll see in a minute, and especially in the second lecture. But you probably have the idea, okay, 1640 is an era in Europe, and we are talking entirely about Europe in this course, which is after the Renaissance. The medieval period had already ended. You had the Renaissance, you had the Reformation, of course, and various other important historical events. But other than that, you probably don't know a lot about what would be going on in 1640. So that's my job. I have to tell you what was going on in philosophy anyway in 1640. And I have to try to tell you why 1640 to 1800 or so is a very important period in the history of philosophy. Of course, one way to understand any concept is to think about the concepts that are connected to it in conceptual space, you might say. So what other parts of philosophy's history are there? Well, here's basically how we think of it. You have medieval philosophy. Before that, you had antiquity, ancient philosophy. And after 1800, you have 2 periods. One we just call the 19th century, and believe it or not, then we have contemporary. You can probably just see contemporary there in the end. I have a way of checking. Anyway, ancient philosophy. Some of you have taken what used to be called Philosophy 100, our ancient philosophy course. This starts, of course, with the pre-Socratics, the philosophers in ancient Greece who wrote in Greek. That makes sense, I guess. Before Socrates, then, of course, we have the Socratic era, which connects, in a way, connects ancient Greek philosophy with the whole rest of the history of philosophy, because you have Plato, who wrote about Socrates, obviously, wrote dialogues. And then, most importantly, perhaps Aristotle, who was Plato's student in the academy. So this period is before the Christian era, before the invention or creation of Christianity. That was a very important fact about it, because most of the medieval philosophers, as you may know, were working within Christianity or Judaism or Islam later on, and they had various ways of understanding what they called the pagan philosophers of the ancient world. Since one of the most important things that philosophy has been about throughout the last 2,000 years or so is its connection to religion on the one hand, in particular, especially Christianity, but not exclusively, and science on the other, that will come later. It's actually been a very important question. How do you understand pre-Christian philosophers? Of course, Judaism existed in the ancient Greek era, but when you're someone like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or William of Ockham and so on, you're working in the Christian context, and you had various ways of understanding how the Greek philosophers could have been so incredibly important and foundational for philosophy, even though they had never heard of Christianity. That's not the focus of this course. That's before our time considerably. Then you have the medieval era, which is extremely long, something like 400 to 1600, maybe a little earlier than 1600. I mentioned some of the great philosophers there, but I'll mention them again. Augustine, Aquinas, William of Ockham. In fact, we only study a certain number of medieval philosophers, and for many centuries there aren't any particularly important philosophers who have made it into what we call the canon. I can write that up here. The canon being our listing of very important figures and texts who every philosophy student should know. Okay, so the medieval period, we'll be hearing more about that later, but you could take it to have ended sometime around 1600. Maybe a little earlier during the Renaissance. We don't often teach courses on Renaissance philosophy, believe it or not, even though the Renaissance would be absolutely central, say, in the history of art or other areas. If you wanted to be more precise and specific, right in here you would say the Renaissance, which occurred, of course, say from 1450 to 1650. There was a rebirth of Platonic philosophy going back to the ancient Greece. Of course, the Renaissance was all about the rebirth of ancient ideas and about ancient wisdom. And that was also important in the 17th century as well. But we're not going to focus on that in our course. So here we are. 1640 is an important date for us because one of our great heroes, one of the heroes of modern philosophy, maybe the person who helped to invent modern philosophy, some would say, was René Descartes. And he published some of his most important works starting in 1640, or 41 actually. You will hear a lot more about Descartes as the semester goes on, especially in our second lecture, which I will send to you very shortly. That will be mostly about Descartes. So he is a key figure, and as a result of when he was first publishing, we often think of modern philosophy as starting in about 1640. We think of it as ending in about 1800 because moving into the 19th century, philosophy underwent a whole series of transformations, and so it's sort of convenient to think of it as bookending what we call the era of modern philosophy. So What's the take-home message so far? Our first basic point, modern in our course refers to 1640 to 1800. Nothing before, nothing after. That will sound strange to you, but that's how we're going to think about things in our course. So if someone is writing in 1500 or 1900 or 2000, they are not a modern thinker. Now, when you zoom into this period, of course, there's a lot of rich detail there, and it's the job of this course to provide you with that detail. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of that right now, and of course, you'll learn a lot more as the semester progresses. So let's erase all this non-modern stuff and focus on what matters. What really matters, 1640 to 1800. I use the Greek letter phi or phi, if you're from the British Empire, or the Commonwealth, I guess, to signify the word philosophy. It's just our shorthand. So what happened in this period from 1640 to 1800? Why was Descartes important? What else was going on in society, etc.? Well, this will be my second major point. I mentioned before that philosophy has emerged in relation to religion on the one hand, especially Christianity, but not exclusively, and in relation to science on the other hand. Well, in fact, the 17th century, as you may know, the era from 1600 to 1700 roughly, is the era of the scientific revolution. Now, the word science and the word scientific and the word, I'll get them all up here. Actually, we want single quotes refer to a word. We'll get used to that. Double quotes allow you to quote from somebody. These words, science, scientific, scientist, are of course in vogue today. They're used today, and they have a rather particular meaning in today's world, as you of course know. In today's world, a scientist is somebody who works in a particular discipline like chemistry, biology, physics, etc. Well, those disciplines did not really exist in 1600 or 1640. There really was no contemporary chemistry. I can't say modern. Any chemistry that you would recognize. This was way before Darwin or any other evolutionary theory or theorist. So there was no biology that you would recognize. There, of course, was no genetics, genomics, neuroscience, molecular anything. Molecules were not part of their knowledge, etc. There was no periodic table. In a way, it was awesome because you could be a great college student, and there were colleges in the 1600s, you may know, both in England and in America and in other parts of Europe. There were universities and colleges. But anyway, in order to be a college student in those days, you didn't have to study any of the things you all have to know now. In fact, the calculus had not been invented. There was no calculus as a result, no organic chemistry. All the things you're studying or have studied recently didn't exist. So what was there? Well, you may know that after the Greeks, for the whole medieval period and going well into the 17th century, in fact, into the 18th century, people used Latin. Latin was the mode of communication for scholars. It was the scholarly language. And this is very important for many reasons, of course, but for our purposes now, the first important reason is it had this word scientia. This word is probably the origin of our word science, but it doesn't mean science in the way that you would mean it, because as I say, in the era when people were using Latin and writing about scientia, biology, chemistry, physics, etc. did not exist as such. So they had to have had something else in mind. Well, what scientia meant, among other things, and of course people had different opinions about what it means, is knowledge. So science, for them, is actually about knowledge, acquiring knowledge of the world, perhaps of the human being as part of the world, etc. Okay. Now, that gives us this one word science for the era of the scientific revolution. But what about these other words? Well, scientific and scientist are a little bit more problematic. So the word scientist actually was not used at all before the early 19th century, not modern philosophy, after modern philosophy. That's right, no one in the history of the world was called a scientist by anyone before 1833. It was actually used for the first time, it was invented, in fact, by a guy named William Whewell. You'll never know how to spell his name. He's one of those great English names that you can't tell how to spell from the way it's pronounced. W-H-E-W-E-L-L, Whewell. Anyway, William Whewell invented this word, scientist, at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1833. And he was talking about a very important woman named Mary Somerville. The first person in the world to be called a scientist was Mary Somerville by William Whewell in the early 19th century in Great Britain. So we are banning this word from our course. It didn't exist. It's very well documented, didn't exist at all. So whenever you might think of Galileo or Robert Boyle or Isaac Newton, they were not scientists in any relevant historical sense. That word didn't exist at all. Were they interested in science or scientia, knowledge of the world? Of course. Of course. But they weren't scientists. The word scientific, very closely connected to the word science, scientist. We're going to ban that word too. Even though people call it the scientific revolution, well, that's not really very historically accurate. So now we need to talk about that. Scientific revolution. What does this mean? I'm sure you've taken a course where people have mentioned the scientific revolution. Maybe you know a lot about it. Maybe you heard about astronomy in the 16th century with Copernicus and Kepler. Maybe you heard about Boyle or Newton or Galileo, etc. in the 17th century. This is often called the era of the scientific revolution, but it isn't a particularly good phrase. More importantly, it's not the phrase that somebody like Robert Boyle or Galileo or Newton would have used. So what would they have talked about if not the scientific revolution? Well, they were doing something else. I will now tell you what that is. They were doing something that they called, get ready, philosophy. Now that sounds strange to you. You think, well, the scientists, whoops, you're not allowed to say that, but it's hard not to use the word. Okay, so the scientists and the philosophers must have been different people. After all, the people who invented or created modern physics, say, like Galileo and Newton, and maybe Boyle, although Boyle was more important for chemistry. After all, those people were scientists in our language. They weren't philosophers, so we're not going to read them in a modern philosophy course, right? Well, turns out that isn't quite true. Actually, what all of these thinkers were doing, according to their own way of thinking, was natural philosophy. They were doing philosophy, and they were studying nature, hence the word natural. And what they took this to mean is a systematic study of nature or the natural world. And included in that would be a study of human beings. Because human beings are part of nature, and the human psyche, that's a good Greek word, obviously the origin of our word psychology, and any ology, of course, comes from logos in Greek too. The study of the psyche is part of natural philosophy because human beings are part of nature. This is what they thought of as natural philosophy. So it would have been better to call it the natural philosophical revolution, but it doesn't sound quite as good. And from the point of view of the future that Newton looked toward, or Descartes looked toward, right? From the point of view of the future, it's the scientific revolution because the people who were scientific or scientists in the 19th century, after Whewell invented the term, and in the 20th century, and even today, they see Galileo, Boyle, Newton, etc. as their most important predecessors, as the people who helped to create the modern sciences as we know them today. So that's why we call it the scientific revolution. It isn't a crazy idea, but it's not very historically accurate. So they were doing natural philosophy. What we will see is that this term, natural philosophy, made it into some very important books in the 17th and 18th centuries. The most famous, you may know, is Isaac Newton's book, published in 1687. We'll talk about it much later in the course. Well, not much later, a little later. It was called Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. He didn't call it Mathematical Principles of Physics or of Science. It was part of what he called natural philosophy, in keeping with what I've been saying. Okay, so you have people like Galileo, Boyle, Newton. So far what you've learned is, well, okay, these people were scientists according to us. According to them, they were natural philosophers. But maybe that's just terminological or semantic. It's not that interesting. But there's a substantive point connected to this as well. Because we also had people like this: Descartes, Leibniz, who you may or may not have heard of, okay, etc. Who are these guys? Well, I've already mentioned that Descartes was one of the founders of modern philosophy. And for those of you who haven't heard of Leibniz, first of all, there's a very good cookie named after him, made in Germany. He was German, although he wrote in Latin, of course. But Leibniz also helped to create or discover or invent, depending on your point of view, the calculus. So these two guys, Newton and Leibniz, both discovered the calculus and thereby ruined the summers of thousands of students around the world who had to study it. But anyway, we need that for modern science, of course. Oh, not modern, contemporary. Okay. Anyway, this group probably seems rather strange to you because you can't really see, well, what does Galileo, who did physics after all, studied motion, used mathematics to study motion, what does he have to do with someone like Descartes or Leibniz, who was a mathematician and a philosopher? Well, those distinctions, mathematician, philosopher, scientist, let alone chemist, biologist, physicist, did not exist in this era. All of these people thought of themselves as philosophers, primarily natural philosophers. They did what I said before. They engaged in a systematic study of nature, including the human being. They developed mathematical techniques to study motion within nature, the motions of the planets, the motions of the stars, the motions of bodies on Earth. I don't know if you can see that up. In class, I'm going to be throwing markers around a lot. It's a lot more exciting in class, but I can do that. Okay. Anyway, so you really should say that these were philosophers, okay? And to distinguish them as a philosopher, a mathematician, a scientist really is not historically accurate. So I guess this is my third major point. When you consider philosophy's relation to science, you're already doing something anachronistic, not historically accurate. Philosophy didn't have a relation to science in the 17th century because to have a relation to it, it would have to be distinct from it. You can't have a relation to yourself. Well, you can, technically you can have the relation of identity. You're identical to yourself, but that's metaphysics and we don't need to worry about that in Philosophy 201. So actually, philosophy had no relation to science. There was no such thing as science distinct from philosophy. What there was in the 17th century was this grand enterprise involving all these figures and many, many more called natural philosophy. So that's what we're going to be studying in this course, among other things. We're not going to be studying that exclusively, but that's absolutely central to the development of modern philosophy. So really, when we call it the history of modern philosophy, we talked about the word modern. Let's talk about this word philosophy. Well, really, it includes what you would think of as science. Now, you don't have to worry. You don't need to know calculus in order to take this course. You don't need to know anything about the history of physics or the history of chemistry, etc. But the point is that what we call philosophy in this course will be really natural philosophy, which is to say it will include the thought of figures like Newton, who we're going to be focusing on later in the semester, and tangentially the thought of people like Galileo and Boyle. Okay, so that's something about the scientific revolution, the era of the scientific revolution, something about the categories that these thinkers would have used themselves, and something about what we really mean by history of modern philosophy. All of this, hopefully, is relatively straightforward. Now we need to hear a little bit more in depth about how philosophers have understood the history of modern philosophy. And here things get really interesting. So, throughout the English-speaking world in Australia and New Zealand, Canada, America, Great Britain, students are taking a course basically focused on 1640 to 1800. They are taking a course called Modern Philosophy, History of Modern Philosophy, whatever it might be. And they are learning about a series of figures like René Descartes, maybe Newton and Galileo, certainly Leibniz, other people like David Hume, John Locke, etc. later. And what they are being told in many cases is the following. So this is sort of my fourth major point. I think I've kept track of them, but if I haven't, you've written them down. Anyway, the next major point, which I think is the fourth point, has to do with the standard grand narrative of the history of modern philosophy. Let's learn about that a little bit. Standard grand narrative. Well, this is what you would learn about, as I say, in courses throughout the world. Not just the English-speaking world, actually, but we can make it simple and limited to that. You would learn that the history of philosophy is a great struggle. There's a lot of sort of military metaphors used about camps and programs and attacks and counterattacks and whatever. Anyway, what you would learn is that the history of modern philosophy is a grand struggle between two major camps or movements. They are typically called rationalism and empiricism. Now, the reason this grand narrative is so useful is that you can take most of the major canonical modern philosophers and put them into one or the other camp. Very useful, very simple, easy to learn. In fact, it works out even better than that. What you end up with is this: Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, all of whom were on the continent of Europe in the 17th century, all of whom wrote in Latin, all of whom were, of course, very important modern philosophers. Okay? And they are opposed to, in this grand narrative, the empiricists, all of whom were in the 18th century and were in Great Britain rather than the continent of Europe. And they would be John Locke, who actually started in the late 17th century, but he's sort of the transitional figure. John Locke, George Berkeley. He was Irish, so we say Berkeley rather than Berkeley. For those of you from California, yes, the town of Berkeley was named after George Berkeley in the 19th century. I think it used to be called Ocean View. You can look it up in the history of California, but I know that it was named after him. Anyway, Locke, Berkeley, and David Hume, who was actually Scottish. So if I said England before, I was wrong. I should have said Great Britain. Anyway, all of these were British rather than continental European philosophers, and they wrote largely in the 18th century. The grand narrative has philosophical substance to it as well. People for many years thought that there was a great divide between these two camps, and they would articulate the divide in different ways. And let me give you those now, just to give you a sense of this grand narrative. So, I don't know if you're going to be able to see all this. That's my problem. Well, let me do the rationalists first, then we'll come back to the empiricists. Okay, the rationalists. What did they believe? What does a rationalist think? Well, there are different ways of articulating this. I'm going to give you two of them, and we'll see later in the course there are going to be others. But this is a good start. First articulation of rationalism. Okay? It's this. the primary source of knowledge, remember that word, scientia, the natural philosopher or the philosopher is interested in scientia, or knowledge. The primary source of knowledge is reason, human reason, and that is usually opposed to experience, sensory experience, perception of the world, hearing something, seeing something, smelling something, tasting something, etc. So, of course, the other side of this coin would be that the empiricists think the primary source of knowledge is experience, sensory experience, or perception. Okay, this is a very important idea. It is something that Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza would say, or did say, under certain circumstances. Of course, the word primary is a key word here. They didn't say the only source of knowledge. How do I know that there's an eraser right here, for example? I mean, would Descartes say that I sort of deduce this from first principles of reasoning? Well, of course not. I know there's an eraser here because here it is in my hand. Now that, of course, relates to a whole series of other complications. The rationalists immediately would start wondering, well, in order to know that there's an eraser here, I have to see an eraser. In order to know that I'm seeing an eraser, I might have to know that I'm not dreaming. I might have to know that I'm not being deceived, etc., etc. We'll get into that later. But in any case, the first articulation of rationalism is the idea that the primary source of knowledge is reason. And the other thing you could say here is that mathematics is absolutely central to rationalism. Mathematics, especially geometry, because the calculus really wasn't introduced until the end of the 17th century. Mathematics is taken to be a paradigm of human knowledge. And many people throughout the centuries have thought that basic mathematical knowledge, like in arithmetic and in geometry, things like the Pythagorean theorem or some basic equation in arithmetic, that kind of knowledge is not empirical knowledge. It isn't knowledge about the way the world happens to be. It's some kind of more secure or robust knowledge. So if you take that to be a paradigm of knowledge, or scientia, then it actually might make sense to think that the primary source of such knowledge is reason itself rather than sensory perception. That's the first articulation of rationalism. And as I say, it does capture some of what Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza thought. The second articulation is related but distinct. It says something that may be a little more technical because it involves a technical phrase you may not have encountered before. There are innate ideas or concepts. Sometimes people think the rationalists really believed, in common with one another, that the human mind has certain basic ideas or concepts built into it. Either they just happen to be there due to historical accident, but of course this is before evolution, so that would be hard to figure out for them. More likely, in their point of view, God endows the human mind with certain basic ideas or concepts. Whatever it might be, this is one articulation, the second articulation of rationalism. Again, mathematics is taken to be a paradigm of the kind of knowledge you might have in your mind innately. So it goes back actually to a dialogue of Plato's that you may have heard of. But in any case, the rationalists would have said, well, there's certain very fundamental concepts, like the concept of a triangle. Geometry is a great example. The concept of a line or a plane, which don't seem to derive from our ordinary sensory interactions with the world. Because after all, when you see a table or you see a tree, nothing in your sensory experience is exactly a triangle, exactly triangular, exactly rectangular. You don't ever see a line in real life. This is actually a pile of ink on a board, right? This isn't actually a one-dimensional object in geometry. It's just a representation of a one-dimensional object. So some people think for the rationalists, the best way to make sense of mathematics and the kind of knowledge we have in mathematics is not just to talk about reason, as we saw before, but secondly, to say that there are innate ideas or concepts. Sure enough, as we will see with Descartes in a few more class meetings, he does believe that the concept of a triangle, for example, is innate. You don't get the concept of a triangle by walking down the street and looking at things that are more or less triangular. And part of the idea is that there's a kind of precision to the ideas we use in geometry and arithmetic. There's a kind of precision that you cannot get from looking at objects that are sort of fuzzy, not exactly triangular, and so on. Also, people have thought that mathematical concepts are abstract. They're not concrete. We'll talk about that later. This brings me to one general point for the entire course. One thing you do in this course, besides learning about the history of modern philosophy, of course, is you learn about contrasts. You learn about distinctions. The distinction, for example, between universal and particular. We think that's different from the distinction between abstract and concrete, or the distinction between innate and non-innate, the distinction between what we call empirical knowledge and a priori knowledge. We'll learn about that later, and so on and so forth. The great thing about philosophy is it helps you to think more clearly, and it does that by saying ordinary language is replete with a lack of understanding of important distinctions. Ordinary language is replete with ambiguous terms, fuzzy terms, unclear terms. Part of philosophy has always been to clarify, make more precise our basic ideas. That's something it has in common, I think, with the sciences, what we would now call the sciences, and with mathematics. We want, when we use a term, we want to use it in a very precise way, and we want to distinguish it from a whole series of other terms which in ordinary language are all put together in one big mush. So anyway, the word innate is a technical term in philosophy, and we're going to see what that means over the course of the semester. Okay, so you have two articulations of rationalism. So now, the empiricists come along for the ride very easily because they believe the opposite in each case. And again, that's one reason the grand narrative of the history of philosophy is so easy to explain. It divides everything up very neatly, and it gives you two ways of understanding this divide, and then you can kind of memorize it and take a test and do well and so on. As you can tell from my demeanor, I don't tend to think that's the best way of thinking about things, but we'll see about that in a minute. Locke, Berkeley, Hume, 18th century, British authors. Locke was actually English, Berkeley Irish, Hume Scottish, so they were British. Okay, let's just go backwards to keep this here. The second articulation. For the empiricists, there are no innate ideas. That actually is one of the great themes of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which was written in the 1670s and 80s, but first published in 1690. For those of you who know about English history, Locke came back with William and Mary in 1688. He had been in exile, and then he published this book, The Essay, in 1690, which became very influential. Mathematics is not the primary paradigm of knowledge for the empiricists, according to this narrative. In fact, ordinary experience is the paradigm of knowledge. What's a paradigm of knowledge in ordinary experience? Saying, oh, I have a cup, and it's full of water. Yeah, how do I know that? Well, I see the water, doesn't have any particular smell, tastes like water. I don't know if you can hear that, but yeah, it sounds like something filled with water. It's too bad it's not a more interesting liquid, but this is 10 a.m. and class time. Anyway, so the paradigm of experience, the paradigm of knowledge for the empiricist is ordinary experience of the world, which gives us lots of knowledge. In fact, if you think about it, and you might if you're an empiricist, it might seem like you know just about everything by having perceptions of the world, by having ordinary sensory experience. How do I know where I am right now? How do I know what day it is? How do I even know what my name is? How do I know anything fundamental like that? Well, it all goes back to somebody telling me something, or to me seeing something or hearing something. It goes back to ordinary sensory experience. Okay? So their idea is all of your ideas and concepts come from sensory experience, i.e. none are innate, none are built into your mind inherently for whatever reason. Okay? That's the empiricist view. Now let's go back to the first articulation, which you've already probably guessed. The empiricists would say again, keeping ordinary experience as the paradigm of knowledge rather than mathematics. First articulation, the primary source of knowledge is perception. I won't write the whole thing out. Not reason. Reason might be useful. We didn't say perception is the only source of knowledge. In fact, of course, reason has got to be useful in some ways. But the primary source of knowledge is ordinary perception. Hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, and so on. That is the basic empiricist point of view. One thing to keep in mind here is we've been talking about knowledge. Sources of knowledge, sources of ideas, sources of concepts. So the grand narrative of the history of philosophy tends to focus on what we would call epistemology. Epistemology is another great word from Greek, as you probably know. If you break it up, you get your ology here from the Greek word logos, the study of, let's say. And you get this word episteme, transliterated from Greek, which means knowledge. So epistemology, logically enough, is the study of knowledge. And it isn't the only part of philosophy. It's an important part of philosophy. But in the grand narrative of the history of modern philosophy, epistemology is crucial. It allows us to distinguish the empiricists from the rationalists. So what's the big deal with this? Why have I suggested that there's a problem? Well, as you may have noticed, the first problem, and this might be my fifth point, first 5A, I don't know. Anyway, the first problem is this is false. That's always a problem if your basic ideas are false. Why is it false? Well, I'll give you two reasons. Or you can say A and B. The two reasons are as follows. First of all, it leaves out all those really important people we were talking about before, Galileo, Boyle, Newton. Okay? So, let's say problems with the grand narrative. The first problem is that it leaves out the people you would call scientists. But why should we leave them out? After all, in that era, Descartes and Newton, for example, were doing the same thing, natural philosophy. It's only later that we think, oh, Descartes is a philosopher and Newton is a physicist and a mathematician. Okay, but in the 17th century, there was no such distinction, as I've said. So the first fundamental problem is it leaves out absolutely crucial actors. Actors in this grand stage. It leaves out Galileo. Is Galileo an empiricist or rationalist? Boyle never really said much about most of those issues. Newton, etc. We want these people to be part of our narrative in this course, especially Newton, because he illustrates my point better than anyone. This may shock you, but you will learn in detail how it's true. Isaac Newton actually spent a lot of his life thinking about, accepting, criticizing, arguing with Descartes. He was very, very interested in Cartesian metaphysics, Cartesian natural philosophy. But the problem is Newton doesn't fit very easily in the empiricist-rationalist divide. He's a 17th century English thinker, but he's not clearly an empiricist. he has rationalist ideas to some extent, he has empiricist ideas to some extent, and also he's got a lot of other ideas that don't really fit. So the first problem with the grand narrative is it leaves out some absolutely central actors. And Leibniz, who is another rationalist, was another great foe of Newton's. Now, it would have been really wonderful if Newton could have been seen as an empiricist, because he's opposing two rationalists, and he is English, and okay, he's working really in the 17th century, but he lived into the 18th, so you can kind of push him into empiricism, thinking of him as kind of an early empiricist. And what's better is he was a great friend of John Locke's. That's actually true. So thinking of him as an empiricist fits in that sense. But the problem with Newton is that he was dealing with a whole host of other issues. How do you understand the motions of objects in the world? For example, he was not interested in the question, what's the primary source of our knowledge? And he said, as far as I know, nothing at all about innate ideas, whether they exist or not. So on the two articulations of what empiricism is, according to the grand narrative, Newton really doesn't fit either one. So you can't cram him into the empiricist category without doing a lot of harm to what he was actually up to. As a result, you have this problem. The grand narrative leaves out these important figures. What's the other problem? I told you it was false. What do I mean by false? False is a pretty strong term. Well, the second problem is as follows. The grand narrative is totally anachronistic. And the reason is the word empiricist, the word empiricism, just like the word rationalist or rationalism, all of these words were invented after all of the people involved in the grand narrative were dead, long dead. In fact, these terms come first and foremost from someone I haven't mentioned yet, Immanuel Kant, who was working in the 1780s and 1790s, that is at the end of the 18th century during the Enlightenment, and who wrote a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, as you may know, in 1781. Kant's the person who invented the grand narrative, and he made up the terms rationalism and empiricism. And the reason that he did that is precisely to show you how you could overcome this great struggle between rationalism and empiricism by following his ideas during the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century. So it was really a self-serving maneuver on his part, which is perfectly fine. But it was not an attempt to present an historically accurate picture of the past 200 years or so of modern philosophy. Kant was not an historian of philosophy. He was a philosopher engaging with the live ideas of Descartes or Leibniz or Hume or Locke. And in doing so, he wanted to fit everybody who had preceded him into one camp or another so that they could all be superseded by the Kantian philosophy, which he called the critical philosophy. As I say, this is perfectly fine for a philosopher to do. Every philosopher, of course, thinks what came before him or her has to be superseded. Otherwise, why would they be bothering to write anything at all? But in this case, the historians of philosophy have adopted the Kantian point of view. And you'll see this in textbooks everywhere. They have talked for generations about rationalism and empiricism, and yet these terms really were not used by the people involved. They were really invented by Kant for his own purposes, and as a result, it's really historically inaccurate. So for those two reasons, leaving out the crucial actors and historical inaccuracy involving these terms that come from Kant, the grand narrative of the history of philosophy is misleading or false. Now, it isn't completely false in the sense that if you look at Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, they do have things in common. They do have beliefs about epistemology that are, let's say, similar to one another, although they differ on many points. And if you look at Locke, Berkeley, and Hume on the empiricist side, they do have things in common too. They do seem to disagree in basic ways with some of the things Descartes thought or Leibniz thought or Spinoza thought. So of course the grand narrative never would have gone anywhere if it had been completely false. But what I would say is it has falsehoods in it. It has historically inaccurate terms, anachronisms, and it leaves out crucial actors. So this is sort of just an overview of what's wrong with the grand narrative. And what we're going to do instead of presenting that narrative to you time after time, class after class, we're going to have a more complicated idea of the history of modern philosophy. We're going to start with Descartes in about 1640. I hope you can see that. Okay. Then what we're going to see is there are two great reactions to Descartes. One by a scientist, really a natural philosopher, called Newton, writing in the 1680s into 1700 or more. Another by the co-inventor of the calculus, Leibniz, writing in the same time. Actually, I should have said 1715 here. Into the early 18th century. Newton and Leibniz both took Descartes to be the most important thinker of the 17th century before them, and they both disagreed with some of his very basic ideas. So Descartes is the crucial starting point. From the debate between these folks, what we get is a discussion involving Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And part of what they're doing is reacting back to Descartes. Part of what they're doing is reacting back to Newton. And part of what they're doing is responding to Leibniz. But we'll see that there isn't any neat divide between empiricism and rationalism that you can really use to understand the thoughts of all of these different figures. I haven't even put in Boyle and Galileo because I'll be talking about them, but they're not going to be central. We're not going to be reading them because you run out of time at some point. What you will see, though, by adding Newton to the mix, it changes everything. Newton did have an influence on later thinkers. He had a long debate during his lifetime with Leibniz, and he replied to Descartes. Leibniz had a long debate with Newton, of course, spent a lot of time replying to Descartes, and had a big influence on and debated things actually with Locke as well. So there are a lot of connections amongst these different thinkers. And one thing that happens is Berkeley definitely replies to Locke, and Hume definitely replies to Locke and to Berkeley, in addition to having thoughts about Newton for sure. So it's a much more complex mélange. It isn't a neat story like the grand narrative, but it has two virtues. One, it includes all the crucial actors. Newton will be our example, but we could also fit Boyle and Galileo in too. And two, it's historically accurate. We're not going to talk about empiricism or rationalism because those terms, as I say, are historically inaccurate and often rather misleading. Finally, we won't be forced in our course to try to figure out how is Locke exactly an empiricist when he says such and such? How exactly is Leibniz a rationalist when he says such and such? That always is a big pain in the neck when you first learn the history of modern philosophy. And I think what we are going to do is, without using these categories of rationalism and empiricism, we're going to look at these thinkers and take them on their own terms and try to see what they were doing. Most importantly, and this might be my sixth point, I should have written these down, I'm sorry, or last point anyway, at least last point for today's lecture. Most importantly, what we're going to do is look at these thinkers and a few others as well, but mostly these thinkers, and try to see what they were doing on their own terms, what categories did they use, what arguments did they make, and try not to worry about how they fit into a grand narrative. Because the fact is that at the time that they were alive, there was no such grand narrative. They were dealing with a completely different intellectual situation than what we have. And so you have to try your best, at least during our class and during the time that you read these texts that we're going to be talking about. You have to try to forget organic chemistry. You have to try to forget the calculus, at least mostly, because most of what you learned was invented later. You have to try to forget physics. You have to try to forget molecular biology, and so on. And you have to say, okay, there was something called natural philosophy, the systematic study of nature, including the human being. And all of these people contributed to natural philosophy, thought about philosophy, excuse me, as connected to other endeavors in the world, what we would call science and what we would call mathematics. And all of them were engaged in one giant conversation about a series of issues that natural philosophers have to deal with. That's what you should try to do in your mind, and then you will understand what it was really like to be alive in 1650 or 1700. Okay, that's the end of today's lecture. So here's what you have to do for your assignment. The syllabus is on Sakai. We are reading Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy as our first book. It was published, as I say, in 1641. There are many translations of this book. You don't have to have this one. This is the Cambridge Green Book translation by John Cottingham. Where is that? John Cottingham. It's hard to do this when you're looking. Anyway, you can read it in Latin if you read Latin. You can read it in English in another translation. That's okay. There's a million out there. The important thing to do, however, is to read the dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne. I will tell you about that. Read the synopsis. This is only a couple pages. And then read and reread the first meditation. The first meditation is 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. Just 4 pages. Okay? And that leads me to my final comment in the first lecture. This course involves texts that are very, very challenging philosophically, intellectually, otherwise. So we don't read a lot for each class. It's not like a history course or an English course where you read 200 pages. In a way, you can think of it more like a problem set where you're really focused very intensely for a number of hours on something that might only take up 1 page or 1 paragraph. In our case, we just have 4 pages for the first meditation. You really should read it and then reread it later. And I highly recommend that you take notes on an iPad, computer, cell phone, or even a good old-fashioned piece of paper, whatever you prefer. You really should take notes on the text because we're going to be bringing the text to class every day. We're going to be talking about it together. We're going to be looking at it. Sometimes we go line by line. My job is to try to help you understand what in the world Descartes is claiming, what his arguments are, to try to give you the resources to evaluate his arguments, to say whether they are successful arguments, convincing or not, etc. So to do that, you have to read and reread the text, take notes on it, and bring your text to class. And then we'll be able to proceed through these different thinkers, and Hume will be our last one at the end of the semester. There's a separate course on Kant, who kind of deserves his own special course. He's much more complicated in some ways. And understanding him really presupposes understanding these own thinkers. So you can take the separate course on Kant if you're interested after you take this course on modern philosophy. Okay, that's it for now. Now I have to turn this thing off.